Morning friends, my name is Avinash Agarwal and I welcome you all to this discussion where we'll be talking about current affairs for 4th of May 2024. I have picked up important topics pertaining to India's global trade as well as state finances. These are very important, very bulky, very relevant topics from an economics point of view. So if you can hear me, if the audio and video is clear, please give me a go ahead in the comment section. Good morning to all of you. As always, I request you all to please make your presence felt in the comment section so that I am aware who is present in the lecture. So am I audible, guys? Right, let us start. Thank you, Charulata. Good morning, Ashwini. Let us start. So let us first talk about India's trade push. So this is basically based out of an important editorial, important opinion column that had gotten published in the Indian Express. It's a fairly important discussion from a foreign trade point of view, right? So let me just kind of typically explain what the challenge is, right? And then contextualize whatever we are discussing in that challenge. Okay. As we are all aware that, and I had mentioned this I think in previous lecture as well, that if you look at India's GDP or any country's GDP or any economy's GDP from demand side, so there are four important engines of demand, right? So there is consumption expenditure, there is investment expenditure, there is a government expenditure, and there is a net exports expenditure, right? And when you add all of these things up, when you add the consumption expenditure with the import expenditure, with the investment expenditure, with the government expenditure, with the net exports expenditure, right, what you get is basically the GDP. Okay, so the size of this GDP is determined by what is happening across these four important variables, right? So net exports is basically what is getting discussed in this particular article or this particular discussion, that how can we increase our net exports. What do I mean by net exports? Net exports means exports minus imports, very simply, right? So if you want to increase your net exports, right, and net exports is basically simplified as X minus M, right? So the challenge in front of any country is that they have to increase their exports as much as they can, right? I'm also tempted to say that they should reduce their imports as much as they can, right? But I don't want to say that, because the moment I say that let us reduce our imports as much as we can, let us increase our exports as much as we can, that sounds very much like a beggar thy neighbor kind of an approach, right? Where we are basically trying to, save as much as we can and earn as much as we can at the same time from the rest of the world, which is not fair actually. You have to be, if you are integrated into the trade with the rest of the world, then you're integrated into trade with the rest of the world. So the best outcome would be that let's just focus upon increasing our exports as much as we can, so that we can create jobs in our country, so that we can create value addition in our own country, so that we can earn a tax revenue in our own country, and so on and so forth, right? So let's increase our exports and let's at least try and minimize our imports, at least all the strategic items, critical items, some things that we should manufacture ourselves and not be dependent on others. Let us be Atmanirbhar or self-reliant in that, right? So that's the basic underpinning that you need to have in mind, that in this particular article, we are essentially going to talk about increasing our exports, right? And let us say bringing production of critical elements, critical items into India, which are a huge burden on our foreign exchange reserves if we try to import all of them. Like for instance, we import a lot of electronic devices, right? It's not as if that we can't manufacture it at all. Okay, so what can we do to manufacture electronic devices? Tomorrow we will start importing a lot of electronic vehicles, but before that happens, let us start making them in India, right? As much as we can, right? Similarly, medical devices. Why do we need to import a lot of medical devices? There is no rocket science involved in medical devices. Let's manufacture them in India. So the essential idea is that items which are having a huge drag, a huge import bill unnecessarily, let's try to make them in India, right? And let us export as much as we can from India. That's keeping that basic idea in mind. We will discuss this particular article, right? So of course, our trade landscape is evolving, and that's not just true for us, it's also true for a variety of other countries as well. So commodity prices have softened, and as a result of commodity prices softening, petroleum exports, etc., in India is also getting so the revenues that we earn typically via petroleum exports that will also soften. If you are not aware of this, so India imports a lot of crude oil that gets processed in our country, and a lot of downstream products, a lot of petroleum based products, right? They get exported out of our country. So a lot of value addition gets done in our country so far as the petroleum value chain is concerned. We don't produce a lot of our own crude oil, so that therefore we are import dependent, but we have fantastic processing capabilities, right? So if you look at India's top import item, you will see petroleum products. If you see India's top export items, again you will see petroleum products. And the difference is that we are importing a crude item, adding a lot of value in that item in our own country, and then we are exporting it, right? So yeah, we will be providing PDF. We are looking at how we can do that. So don't worry about it. We will definitely find a way. In the meanwhile, you can download our app, right? So it will either be through the app, or it will create some kind of a group, maybe on a Telegram or something like that, and we'll share the details. So we are definitely going to share the PDFs with you. Definitely not a problem over here. Okay. So we have certain traditional sectors like petroleum exports that, of course, we need to nurture these sectors. But at the same time, there are also emerging sectors such as electronics, pharmaceuticals, agriculture. These are very promising sectors. Apart from that, we are also signing a lot of free trade agreements. So we have already signed free trade agreements with UAE and EFTA. These are important free trade agreements, and further more free trade agreements are in the annual. And the idea is that we want to emerge as a major exporting nation. If you look at the thrust of the government in the last 10 years, whether it is the Make in India scheme, production linked incentive scheme, the massive push for infrastructure, the massive push for improving our ease of doing business rankings, and so on and so forth. So those are all essentially ideas which are trying to make India an exports destination or a manufacturing destination, right? Very quickly, what has been India's trade dynamics post independence? This is a very 30,000 feet view. Okay, it's not detailed at all, right? So just keep that in mind. Okay, it's a very 30,000 feet view. So post independence up till, let us say, 1990s, right? Why 1990s? Because in 1990s we launched economic reforms, liberalization, privatization, and globalization reforms, and we take a radical turn towards being a market economy, where the government's interference or the government's intervention will be minimized, right? So that will happen in 1990s. But let us say from 47 to 1990s, the general policy that India was adopting was that our trade was heavily protected, in the sense that there were heavy import barriers, so that domestic industries could be protected for domestic players, domestic market could be protected for domestic players. So we were discouraging imports because we wanted to keep the Indian market available for the Indian manufacturers as much as possible. So we erected high trade barriers, high import duties, high quantitative restrictions, right? So there were a lot of import barriers, so that imported goods are not coming easily into India. There were strict industrial regulations as well, right? And there was a lot of focus on import substitution, that produce as much in India as possible. So this overall system was one where the trade openness was fairly limited. You couldn't easily import or export, right? Laissez-faire concept did not apply so much in this domain, that you could do whatever you want. So far as import and export is concerned, you required government's license, government's permission at every stage, so much so that it becomes very stifling, and the overall system or the overall set of policies was ridiculed by calling them as a license Raj system. That British Raj was replaced by license Raj, that you need a license for absolutely every economic activity. So essentially the picture from 47 to 90s is one where economic freedom is not so freely available, right? And that is the kind of picture that we start changing from 1990s onward. So we do these liberalization reforms. Whenever I teach students, whether it is Indian Economic Service or optional, or whether it is RBI, and I teach or talk about liberalization, so my two-word definition of liberalization is economic freedom, right? That essentially liberalization talks about increasing the economic freedom for everybody, for the taxpayers, for the investors, for the entrepreneurs, for the traders, right? We are increasing, we are giving them freedom. We are not curbing them with licenses. We are not curbing them with permissions. We are not curbing them with government monopolies. We are not reserving sectors. We are giving a lot of economic freedom, right? So we undertake these reforms, liberalization reforms, right? Why do we undertake this liberalization reform? That can be a whole different lecture. We were facing a balance of payment crisis. We had ran out of foreign exchange reserves, right? And we were not in a position to pay our import bills. We were not in a position to pay interests for foreign loans that we had taken. We are not in a position to pay back those foreign loans because we had ran out of foreign exchange reserves. Let us say that we had ran out of dollars, right? So why is it that a country is running out of dollars? Should not be very difficult to imagine. You are not exporting enough, so you are not earning enough. You are importing quite a lot, so your bills are high. On top of that, you have taken a lot of loans which you have to repay again in foreign currency which you don't have. So what is the problem, boss? You start earning dollars, you start attracting dollars. And when I say dollar, I mean the larger foreign exchange reserve. It is dollar, pound, euro, yen, whatever the case. So let's just, when I say dollar, you automatically understand that I'm talking about foreign exchange reserves. So we are neither earning a lot of dollars nor attracting a lot of dollars. If you want to earn dollars, you export. You export goods, you export services. And if you want to attract dollars, then you be a stable country where investors are willing to put their money, whether in the form of direct investment or in the form of portfolio investment, right? Or there are a lot of NRIs sitting abroad, they have a lot of money, they should be willing to put their money into your country, but anybody will put their money into your country or invest their money into your country only when they are sure that your economy is stable, which means that inflation should be under control, fiscal deficit should be under control, government's borrowing should be under control, there should be a lot of freedom for innovation, freedom for entrepreneurship, freedom for dynamism, freedom for competition, and so on. These are the typical hallmarks of a country which is attractive for people with money, right? So India started becoming all of these things, so that A, we can start earning more dollars via exports, and B, we can become attractive for foreign investors or those who are having dollars to put into our country in a variety of ways, right? So we dismantled the license Raj, we liberalized trade, we opened up foreign investment, we adopted market oriented policies, right? So we gradually opened up to global markets. Slowly and steadily, India started reducing its import duty. Slowly and steadily, India started dismantling the quantitative restrictions. It was being done very slowly and steadily, and there is nothing wrong in it, right? We were doing it slowly and steadily. So we liberalized our trade policies and we gradually opened up to the global markets, right? We signed several bilateral trade agreements, regional trade agreements with ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, etc., right? And thereafter we focused a lot on global economic integration, right? There is a lot of focus on global economic integration. Like for instance, recent foreign trade policy 2023, it is talking about towns of export excellence scheme. Basically, we want to create hubs which can become launch pad for our exports. So ideally, those hubs should have the soft as well as the hard infrastructure in place, right? Which can help them become true towns of export excellence. You will not only require a mindset, an attitude, right? Not only within entrepreneurs, but also within bureaucrats, down to the local policeman who is basically allowing the trucks to move freely or not move freely, right? So if you want to become a town of export excellence, then the software and the hardware needs to be appropriately installed, correct? Hardware can mean roads, electricity, water supply, effluent treatment, pollution, pollution abating or pollution mitigating kind of technology and so on, right? So that is the hardware. Okay, so towns of export excellence scheme, we have been negotiating a lot of free trade agreements with European Union and United Kingdom. So when I went to European Union, when I went to Spain as a part of my MBA at IIM Calcutta recently, so over there they have this attitude that okay, how will India be able to negotiate with us, right? We have a lot of experience of negotiating a lot of free trade agreements, we have a lot of power in our hands, right? We don't think that, and not everybody is having this idea, but some people were having this idea that India will not fare well in negotiations with the European Union so far as free trade agreement is concerned. And my point was, and my point still is, that boss, India is the future. Okay, the growth is in India, the people are in India, the demand is in India. Your company and everybody want to come and sell in India. Of course, India also wants to sell in European Union, no doubt about that. And to think that India doesn't have the ability to exchange, to negotiate for free trade agreements, etc., that is a little too far-fetched, right? I mean, the way government has been taking a very strong stance of late, that basically means that they know what they are doing, right? But that was just a side note, right? So any which way, these negotiations are on the way. We are trying to encourage rupee trade. We are trying to put into place a digital infrastructure, right? So for instance, UPI as a platform, it is basically going abroad, right? Overseas markets are accepting UPI payments, whether it is UAE, France, Mauritius, Sri Lanka. So UPI is becoming very popular, which means that what India is proposing or what India is developing is getting acceptability abroad, which is a very important thing, right? We need to be able to start changing our image, right? And that image makeover needs to happen. And that needs to happen in frontier technologies or important areas. And in that sense, UPI is helpful in changing image, if not anything else. This rupee trade, what is rupee trade? That if let's say that you are Russia, I am India, I am buying from you, then I need to pay you, right? So what should I pay you? Should I pay you dollars? I can't pay you dollars, right? Because America will apply sanctions and they will freeze your dollars, right? So how do we trade? So can we trade in rupees and rubles, right? That we can use our own currency, right? And we don't need to rely upon any other currency for our trade. So we are trying to do that with a number of countries. It's not very successful. I'll probably have a separate discussion on it some other time, that why internationalization of rupee or why utilization of rupee in settling of foreign trade bills is something which is not taking off. So I'll discuss with you on some other note, but it is something which we are trying, but it's not really taking off in a very big way. We are trying to bring about internationalization of rupee, right? We have opened Vostro accounts and Nostro accounts, right? These are things that you should be aware of. I'll not go into this direction as of now in this particular lecture, because that will completely derail my momentum, right? But we are trying to internationalize rupee and we have not achieved a lot of success, right? Be that as it may, trade as a percentage of GDP, right? So that is an indicator of your country's openness. So you put the trade in the numerator, you put the GDP in the denominator, you multiply it by 100, and the percentage that you get, right? That is basically, and what do I mean by trade? So your imports plus exports combined together is your trade, right? So trade divided by GDP into 100, that tells you what is the trade as a percentage of GDP. And if this number is high, that means that there is greater integration with the rest of the world. There is greater openness towards the rest of the world. And if this number is low, that typically indicates that you are following an isolationist policy or a protectionist policy or an autarkic policy, right? These are the typical terms that indicate closeness towards international trade, right? Autarky, AUTARKY, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe there is a C somewhere in between, right? Autarky. So of course, India was never an autarkic country. We were never completely close to trade the way North Korea is or the way Iran is to a certain extent, right? But definitely we were not exactly having an open door policy, as can be reflected in this graph. So you can see that for a fairly longish period of time, India's trade as a percentage of GDP was around 10% or less than 10%, right? A break happens somewhere in 1985 for me, when the graph secularly moves upwards and thereafter it keeps going up. And the problem that you see over here, right, that's not a problem that we created, right? This problem that you see over here, it's not a problem that we created. So in 2008, you have the global financial crisis erupt, and there is a lot of weakness in the external market. So we are not able to sell abroad because they are not able to buy from us. So there is a fluctuation, there is an up and down over there. Then there is a Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. So again, there is a lot of weakness in the external market. So again, there is problem in, selling abroad. It's not easy to sell abroad, right? So all the volatility, all the fluctuations that you see, that's because of the way things have been in the last 10-15 years in the international market, right? So which sectors have been propelling India's trade growth? So of course, services sector is playing a major role. So exports have surged over 11% in 2023. IT enabled services, this is the powerhouse, right? India is the back office for a variety of operations. India is involved in software development. There are a lot of call centers in India. There is a huge talent pool. Now, it's not just that India is a back office. Now, India is emerging as a hub for location of a lot of GCCs, capability centers, R&D centers, design centers, and so on. Because we have the requisite manpower, trained manpower, skilled manpower with the right attitude, right skill sets, right motivations, and they demand the right salaries so far as foreign companies' point of view is concerned. Tourism and hospitality is also attracting a lot of dollars into India, lot of tourists are coming into India. Dekho Apna Desh, etc. kind of policies are also promoting India as a destination for tourists. Medical and wellness tourism has been attracting a lot of patients from abroad, right? Because India has hospital care, India has doctors, etc. They are top notch in quality terms, as good as the rest of the world, and they are very cheap as compared to the rest of the world, right? So a lot of patients come into India on a regular basis. Like for instance, 1.4 million medical tourists visited India in 2022, and a lot of state governments are now competing with each other to develop this medical and wellness tourism industry within their own states, right? Like for instance, of course, Maharashtra is doing pretty well for itself, right? There are states in South India which are doing pretty well for themselves. So that's a positive competition that is emerging. Well, so far as the goods sector is concerned, right? So engineering goods, right? So there is a surge in machinery, vehicles, and capital goods like generators and transformers. So this sector is booming quite a bit thanks to Make in India, thanks to PLI, right? So if you see the share of electronic goods in India's merchandise exports, so that was around 2% and it is now around 6.5%. So this is a massive success story, right? Because I remember 10 years ago, we used to talk about 3 important areas where we need to work. One is gold, another is electronics, third is oil. We are unnecessarily importing a lot of these things, right? Now we have done quite a bit for the first 2. In fact, we are doing quite a bit for all the 3 streams. Like for instance, electronics, we are manufacturing more and more of it in India itself. For gold, we are trying to move away from investments into gold, and we are trying to, popularize sovereign gold bond and such kinds of schemes, which are actually very popular now in India, right? And of course, we are moving away from fossil fuel as a category, but it will take its own sweet time. But yeah, this is definitely an important success story that you need to keep in mind regarding India's merchandise exports. Pharmaceuticals, India is the leading generic drug manufacturer. We are supplying affordable medicines across the world. Textiles and apparel, we have always been around this $30-35 billion mark, right? So we exported textiles around $31 billion mark. I feel that this is where we are underperforming, because like I said, that even back in 2012, when I was working as a journalist in the textile industry, I used to see that this number was around $30-35 billion, right? So I don't see that a lot of changes have happened over here, which is again a little sad. Agriculture and processed food, this is something where we are doing pretty well, right? We have reasonable targets for ourselves, and if this picks up, then food processing in India will pick up. A lot of job creation, a lot of value addition will happen in India, and we are doing the right set of things. In the last couple of lectures, we have spoken a lot about MDH and Everest and spices and exports of foods getting held up abroad because of contamination with ethylene oxide and contamination with lead and contamination with salmonella and so on and so forth. So we have talked about a lot of that. So of course, that is a bad part. We need to take care of it. But otherwise, agriculture and especially processed foods is something which is increasing quite a bit, right? There are additional factors which are favoring us, like for instance, free trade agreements, especially the renegotiated free trade agreements, right? So they are going to help us. They should help us, right? So European Free Trade Agreement, Mauritius, UAE, they are steps in the right direction, right? Startup ecosystem has been nurtured very carefully in India, right? So some of the best, not always the best in all the sectors, but very good startups kind of exist in India, right? And we need to go to the next stage. If you look at startups in India, right? So by and large, they have been basically emulating what has already been done abroad. So our Swiggies and Zomatos and our, Flipkarts and so on and so forth, kinds of startups, they have basically emulated a model which has already existed abroad, right? So maybe some kind of a reverse innovation or a flow of startups from India to abroad could be something which probably in the next decade, could be looked at from the startup space, right? So startup ecosystem is definitely thriving, right? There are a lot of tech startups, right? So that's a very good thing, because we want to be ahead in these frontier technologies. So that will be very, very crucial to look at. Demographic dividend, you already understand. We've already spoken about it in the previous lecture, that a huge chunk, 65% of India's population is under 35 years of age group. So from a point of view of having factors of production, we have strong labor force, right? And we need to find right jobs for them. We need to create right jobs for them. There is a significant push to create infrastructure, Bharatmala, Sagarmala. We are creating roads and highways like never before. We are inaugurating bullet train projects like never before. our airports are increasing like never before, right? And all of these things together, they should help in the logistics part of the equation, right? That logistics part should our performance on, let us say, logistics performance index or some such index should definitely improve going ahead for the kind of money that we are putting in, right? Still, there are certain roadblocks. What are those roadblocks? So there is a decline in international commodity prices, right? So that automatically sort of creates a downward pressure on your revenues. Like for instance, crude oil prices, right? When they decline, so our revenues from our petroleum exports, they automatically come down, right? So those fluctuations obviously have a role to play, not just on our finances, but on other countries' finances as well. Labor intensive sectors, we are not doing as well as we want to do. Like for instance, textiles, gems and jewelry, leather products, right? So we always wanted labor intensive manufacturing industry to really pick up in India, right? Because that would create the kind of jobs that we need, so that surplus people from agriculture can be pulled into these jobs which are available 365 days, these jobs which pay well, these jobs which may be formal sector jobs, right? But we have not been able to really do that. Rejections of food and pharma products, we have spoken about this, right? So whether it is your cough syrups or whether it is your MDH and Everest ke masales, we need to pull our socks up for this. There is a geographical concentration of exports, right? So we are still dependent on few major markets such as US and European Union. So we need to be able to diversify our export destinations, right? And it is very much possible to do that now. Like for instance, West Asia should be focused upon quite a bit, because West Asia is coming up in a very strong way, right? There has to be a lot of emphasis on West Asia. Maybe we can also start looking at Latin America, some pockets in Africa, right? So that kind of diversification of destinations is always very crucial. The way forward is that we need to look at our labor intensive sectors. Maybe we can establish dedicated artisan zones or create state of the art infrastructure, collaborate with international fashion houses, implement craft tourism initiatives, because ultimately we need to create jobs in India, right? So if these steps, if we take in the right direction, can help us, then nothing like it, right? Like for instance, when we talk about textiles, so there is some initiative that government had launched called Mitra Parks, right? Textile Mitra Parks or something like that. So what happened to those Mitra Parks? Because I remember around 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there used to be a lot of talks around textile related special economic zones, right? So dedicated special economic zones for textiles called textile parks, right? What happened to those textile parks? So whatever we implement, let's say even if we have implemented a textile park scheme 15 years ago, right, then we need to kind of follow up on that and understand where it failed, why it failed, whom to blame, whom to pin the blame upon, what can we learn and how can we improve. I am not sure whether we are doing that, right? I'm not sure whether we are doing that. At least this part I'm reasonably sure about, that those textile parks did not pick up, and then we launched some Mitra scheme. So this is old wine in new bottle. So if we are serious about these labor intensive sectors, then there has to be a lot of accountability for a lot of projects that were launched, because they were expensive projects, right? And we should have implemented them well. There has to be farm to fork traceability. Easier said than done, because in India the value chain is absolutely fragmented. There are a lot of formal and informal players existing simultaneously. There are a lot of small, large and medium farmers existing side by side large farmers. There is an APMC route and there is a private trade car route, right? So traceability is important, right? The good companies, good investors, good startups will be able to establish traceability, right? Quality compliance, etc. will be established. But again, this is something that we need to work on. Brand India global marketing campaign needs to be launched, right? So like for instance, everything that is coming out of India, it should be infused with a quality assurance, right? And the day we are able to achieve that kind of an image, and trust me, other countries have done that in the past. Like for instance, Japan at one point of time used to have a notorious reputation for producing absolutely cheap and filthy quality goods which you couldn't really trust upon. But then within a matter of no time, with consistent efforts, with proper branding, with consistent engineering practices, manufacturing practices, they were able to create an image for themselves that good from Japan must be of top-notch quality, right? So countries have done that kind of reinvention and re-christening for themselves, we can probably think on similar lines. It's not going to be just cosmetic, that if like how dignitaries come from abroad, and what we do is in Mumbai is that, for instance, we cover the slums with canopy so that slums are not visible as you're traveling on the highway. Not that kind of an approach, because it's not going to work. Everybody knows what's happening, but a genuine approach where we are taking the right kind of steps. And of course, we need to focus on regional trade agreements. We have been sitting out of RCEP, right, because we felt that it's not right for us for a variety of reasons, etc. So we really need to be a part of the right regional trade agreements, right? And those agreements need to work for us. Like, for instance, there was this study that was done by Arvind Subramanian a couple of years ago, which showed that we have signed free trade agreements with, let us say, South Korea, let us say with the Japan, right? Or let us say with such countries, but we have not really benefited from the same. Whereas they have benefited a lot. So their exports to India have increased a lot. Our exports to those countries did not increase. So we did sign free trade agreements, but we could never benefit from them. So when you are focusing on regional trade agreements, that means that we need to make them work for us rather than get exploited by those free trade agreements. That is the broad idea that we need to keep in mind. So this is my entire discussion for this article. Is there anything that anyone would like to ask, say, or share? Please feel free to use the comment section, right? So I see that there is MS, there is Rashmi, there is Ashwini, there is Charulata, and there are a lot of other folks in this lecture. So maybe you all want to type something at this point of time, right? Do you all understand? If you understand, just type okay, good, whatever you want to type. Just type something, right? The next topic that I want to discuss with you is about state budgets or state finances. Let me give you the basic background of this, right? And then we will move ahead. But before that, again, my request is that please be kind enough to just type something in the comment section so that I can see who is present. Now, when we speak about Government of India's finances, typically what are we talking about? We are talking about its borrowing requirements, right? We are talking about its tax revenues, that what is the growth in the tax revenues, etc., because tax revenue is an important figure. So there are two sides. There is the there is a receipt side where you are arranging for money, and there is an expenditure side where you are spending money, right? So either you get money through taxes or through non-tax revenue, or you do some kind of a disinvestment, right? Or you do some kind of a borrowing, right? So these are typically what we talk about from a receipt point of view, right? Right. Thank you, Shreya. From an expenditure point of view, we see where is the money going. We see how much is being spent on capital expenditure, which is basically money spent for creation of assets, creation of infrastructure, and so on and so forth. We see what is happening on the revenue expenditure front, right? That are we able to rationalize our subsidies or not? Are we able to reduce our wasteful expenditure or not? So typically we try to keep this under control. And typically we try to maximize this. That is typically what we try to do. And in this overall equation, we try to keep the borrowing transparent and under control. We don't want to lie about our borrowings, right? And we don't want to borrow too much, right? And we definitely don't want to borrow and waste it on a revenue expenditure kind of an expenditure head, right? These are some of the basic, very, very basic things that we typically look at when we are talking about Government of India's finances, right? Now, when we go from Government of India towards Government of States, right, what gets added to this equation? There are just a couple of things that get added to this equation. Number one is the transfer of funds that is happening from center to states, right? So this transfer of funds that is happening from center to states, that may be a devolution of taxes, which means that central government is collecting a lot more tax. State governments have a lot more responsibilities, but they don't have a lot of money. So money needs to be devolved from the center towards the states, right? So that kind of devolution or that kind of transfer is one thing that we need to talk about. So that transfer can happen in the form of devolution of taxes. It can happen in the form of grants, right? It can happen in the form of loans, right? So one thing that gets talked about, apart from states' own taxes or states' own non-tax revenue or states' own revenue, right? Or states' own borrowing, right? One thing that gets talked about on the receipts side is the transfer which is coming from the center towards the states. This is an additional complexity that we have to face when we do this discussion, right? Apart from this, another thing that gets complicated is, when we talk about own revenue. So what is the local level of taxation, right? Are the local governments able to collect taxes at their own level or not, etc. So those are the kinds of things that we need to look at, right? States ka borrowing program needs to be approved by the center. If it does not get approved by the center, states will not be able to borrow so easily. So these are some additional complexities on the receipt side. On the expenditure side, it is more or less the same, right? That states should be able to prioritize capital expenditure. States should be able to keep their revenue expenditure under control. States should be able to empower local levels of government, right? Because local governments can spend on local requirements. They can take care of local plans, etc., etc. So typically, this is the broad framework that you need to keep in mind. And in this framework, we will do whatever discussion that we do. Additional complexity is that there is only one government of India, but there are like what, 29 states and many union territories, etc., right? So certain states are doing well on some front, certain states are not doing well on another front, certain states are borrowing very heavily, certain states are able to manage their budget within reasonable constraints. Like for instance, recently Kerala had dragged the union government, I think, to the Supreme Court. There was a lot of contestation that was happening between Kerala and union government regarding Kerala's finances, right? So I'll not talk about Kerala's finances specifically over here, but what I'm trying to say is that given the fact that there are so many different states, etc., right? So there is going to be a lot of contestation on that front. Right, now let us decode states budgets, right? So one fact is that states budgets, they are less scrutinized, right? And that is changing now. More and more studies are focusing upon states budgets. There is a rise in market borrowings of state governments. So we need to talk about that as well, right? And of course, state budgets, they are publicly available information, and comptroller and auditor generals, etc., they are releasing a lot of studies based on the same. So we need to kind of have a look at what's coming out over there, right? 24-25 budget, it was a vote on account, right? And a lot of data is available for 26 states, right? So states, they are expecting a 9.2% growth in their combined revenue receipts. Combined revenue receipts means probably their entire revenue that they are going to receive, entire meaning from variety of sources. So they are looking at a 9.2% increase. Now what is the problem over here? This is a typical problem that not just with the states, but even with the central government, and this problem may be coming down a little bit, but there is a problem over here. And the problem is that how reliable is this number of 9.2%? Typically what happens is a lot of times our projections and the actual realizations are way off the mark. So many times, and I'm not just talking about states over here because this is a genuine problem, that what we do is that we do a lot of accounting engineering, and upfront our numbers are fantastic on the day of the announcement of the budget. So there is no problem over there. But when you see the revised estimates and the actual estimates, you see that there is a problem, and we will see a little bit of that happening in the states also. So one thing that you need to be very mindful about right up front, right off the bat, is that when I say that there is going to be a 9.2% increase in the combined revenue receipts, don't take it on face value. There is all likelihood that you will not be able to meet this number, right? Now, what is the fiscal position of the Indian state governments? First is over reliance on their own revenue, right? So half of the total revenue of states is from own taxes, own revenues, right? So if there is a deviation, there is a problem over here, right? Like for example, right? What we are budgeting is that the state's own tax revenue, right? It will expand by 13.8%, and we had estimated. So all these 26 states put together, last year they had said that our own tax revenue will increase by 15.4%, and no surprises that this number was not achieved, right? Now we are saying that this state's own tax revenue will further increase by 13.8% in this year. No surprises that this number will not be achieved, right? So that is what you need to keep in mind, okay? That it has been far below the actual growth of the own tax revenue has been far below what was projected last year. So last year's numbers are going to come in, quite below where they should be, and therefore next year's numbers are also not going to be where they should be. Right now, whatever we are saying is not going to work out, right? So, like for example, whether it is sales tax or whether it is state GST or whether it is excise duty, these numbers were below what they should have been, right? So that means that this year you need to have a much higher growth in your numbers to be able to compensate for last year, which you will not be able to do. It's like, you promise that you will study for 8 hours every day for 5 days, but in the first 3 days you ended up studying for 4 hours. Now in the next 2 days you want to compensate and you want to study for 28 hours. It's not going to work, right? So that's the kind of problem over here, right? Devolution from center to states. So around 40 to 45% of the revenue of the states, it is coming from the center. And like I said, that it can come in the form of taxes, it can come in the form of grants, right? So the taxes devolved, they are projected to increase by 10.4%, right? And the states, they have benefited from higher than budgeted tax devolution for 3 consecutive years. So in this sense, wherever states were lagging behind, they were helped, right? And again, this is also uncertain, you don't know, right? This is another problem, that central government has given a projection, which they may give a conservative projection. If central government has learned anything from dealing with state governments, probably that lesson would be that give conservative estimates and then overperform. Why? Because if you give very fancy estimates and then end up underperforming, then states will create a lot of problem for you, right? So the idea over here is that for the last 3 years, central government has been giving more than what they had promised. But again, you can see that this is a source of uncertainty. You don't know whether this will always be the case or not, right? Apart from that, right now, the way things stand, so SGST is the most important source of tax revenue for the state government. So earlier there used to be sales tax, VAT, etc. You know that when we brought into place GST, so the states, they gave up a lot of their tax sovereignty, meaning that they gave up a lot of taxation rights, meaning that a lot of powers related to taxation for all the states, they were pooled together, and we created a GST framework for the entire country, one common coordinated framework for the entire country, right? So state GST is a very important source. So there is some buoyancy, right, in that. What do I mean by improved tax buoyancy? So see boss, economic activity, one level of economic activity should generate an X amount of tax. If that economic activity goes up or increases, your tax revenue should also increase. That is the essential meaning of buoyancy. But if my economic activity is going up and my tax is remaining stubbornly low, that means my tax buoyancy is not good. Whereas if the level of economic activity is increasing and my tax buoyancy or my tax collection is also increasing, that basically means that my tax buoyancy is behaving properly, right? So what is happening now is that so far as our SGST is concerned, excise duty, stamp duty, registration fees on vehicle, etc. is concerned, some decent level of buoyancy is being seen, which is again a very good thing for the states, right? So states tax buoyancy has increased, right? SGST has a buoyancy above 1, right? So when economic activity picks up, state GST is picking up even more, right? Buoyancy being more than 1 means that for, let us say, an X percentage increase in economic activity, there is a greater than X percentage increase in SGST, right? So how is it that SGST is increasing at a much faster rate than economic activity? Maybe because of better tax administration, maybe because of better compliance, right? Maybe because tax evasion is getting plugged, right? So people who are stealing, they are being brought into the system forcibly, right? And we are not complaining, so that's good, right? Certain reforms were taken by state government. So states have been undertaking taxation related reforms, right? So they have reset their stamp duties, they have revised the fair value of land parcels, they have introduced e-stamping, digital stamping, so that the entire taxation system becomes smooth, right? Apart from that, they have revised excise duty on liquor. They have introduced social security cess on liquor consumption. They have increased the license fee. They have started these digital modes of payment so that revenue leakage can be stopped, right? Apart from that, from a motor vehicles point of view, so they have revised the life tax on vehicles. They have introduced green taxes, right? They have been punishing vehicle tax defaulters with hefty penalties. So whatever they can do within their scope, they are doing whatever they can. SGST they cannot individually touch, but whether it is motor or whether it is liquor or whether it is stamp duty, etc., this they can manage on an individual basis, that they are doing, right? They are doing as much as they can. What are the different concerns? Some concerns I have already highlighted to you, right? So there is variation in grants as per revised budgeted estimates. So like for instance, what happens is that the central government is running a lot of centrally sponsored schemes, and as you may be aware that many of these centrally sponsored schemes are run in the expenditure ratio of 60:40, so far as mainland states are concerned at least. right? In the sense that 60% of the expense towards these schemes will come from the central government, 40% will have to be borne by the state government. What I'm essentially trying to say is that there is a lot of partnership in the implementation of these central sponsored schemes. So central government should pay up its own share of expenditure towards these central sponsored schemes in a timely manner, in an appropriate manner, and many times that does not happen, right? So there is a lot of variation in that, and states have to deal with that kind of a variation. Maybe because states are not complying with the guidelines, maybe because they have not submitted utilization certificates, maybe because they have not submitted the proof of work done. So for a variety of reasons, wrong and right, you see that there is a lot of variation. There is also variance in devolution of grants across states. So some states they receive on time, some states don't receive on time. There is a lot of debt issuance that is happening via the states. Like for example, and this is something which needs to be looked at in a deeper way in some other discussion. So like for instance, if you see, right, if you see the actual debt issuance during March 2024, it was 1.9 trillion rupees, and earlier indicated amount was 1.3 trillion rupees. So instead of issuing debt for 1.3 trillion, we issued debt for 1.9 trillion, 51% higher. So there is this possibility that this money has been raised because of elections, etc., because of which budgets, etc., are a little bit here and there for a lot of state governments. So maybe because of that, right? So maybe they have chosen to use up a large part of their borrowing before the year ended, right? This is again typically referred to as March rush, right? That okay, you had envisaged that you will borrow this much amount of money throughout the year. That means that money should have been utilized throughout the year. But typically what happens is that we back end a lot of borrowing, we back end a lot of expenditure, right? So that's typically how governments are working. It's called March rush, right? That as the deadline approaches, you start ramping up your activities, right? Low capital spending by states, that is a concern, right? So parliamentary elections again can be blamed for the same, right? Capital spending by states, it's likely to end up being heavily back-ended, right? So again, what happened last year may happen this year, and again, this is not desirable, right? It should be a little more uniform, it should be a little more consistent. To give you a parallel example, the union government pulled its budget proceedings ahead, right? So they announced a budget on 1st of February rather than later towards the year. Why? So that money is available at the start of the financial year in April itself for all the ministries to spend, so that this March rush concept can be avoided. That's not the way we should be doing. So maybe the state governments need to look at this more carefully. There is some degree of technical efficiency, right? Like for instance, a lot of tax rates are higher than what they should be, right? Like for example, stamp duty rates, they range at 5 to 8% across states in India, right? Whereas internationally the average is less than 5%. And stamp duty is stamp duty. So why is that they are trying to charge a higher tax rate? Because this higher tax rate, it leads to high transaction cost, tax evasion, and destabilization of the land markets, right? So there is this level of tax inefficiency which probably we need to look into. Maybe we are not following a very scientific mechanism, at least insofar as the example that I have given. There is lack of uniformity in motor vehicle tax structure. So the current GST slabs 5%, 12%, 18%, 28%. There is a lot of complexity, right? So there is varying incidence of taxes per vehicle in different states, right? So the competition is different, the application is different, right? So your lifetime and annual tax rates are different. Use of specific and ad valorem rates, multiplicity of rates, it is causing a lot of confusion in the motor vehicle tax structure. And eventually there are a lot of court cases, a lot of appeals that get filed, and a lot of revenue that gets stuck. So maybe we need to do something about this aspect, right? Apart from that, given the fact that states cannot do much with SGST, and given the fact that there is little that they can do in terms of tax revenue, so they have started trying to amp up the non-tax revenue a little bit, right? So what they have started doing is e-auctioning of mining leases, royalty revisions across different segments of mining minerals, revision of penal rates to curb secret mining. So they are doing everything that they can towards the non-tax revenue aspect, but there is always a limit that you can go, right? So that is another thing that we need to look at. There is a divergence between state and central government. That's a part of our constitutional design. So if you see, right, central government, like I mentioned earlier, they have all the larger, meatier and chunkier tax revenue for themselves, whereas the expenditure burden on the states is higher, right? Because they have to take care of education, healthcare, law and order, agricultural development, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a clear vertical imbalance in India, right? That the states don't have adequate revenue, right? So Indian states, they collect 37% of general government taxes while they spend 64% of total expenditure. So clearly they have to rely upon transfers, and those transfers are a headache, right? Another concerns that states have is related to cess and surcharge, right? So cess and surcharge is what the central government collects and doesn't share with the state government, right? So the central government is mandated to share the tax revenue and stuff, but when it comes to cess and surcharge, they don't share this. Now the problem is that late 2011-12, cess and surcharge was around 6.4%, of the gross tax revenue, right? And now the cess and surcharge is 17.7% of the gross tax revenue. So what the central government is doing is that obviously it cannot collect too much from the people, but otherwise its own image will, be in a bad light. So what it does is that it gives concessions on a variety of different taxes and then collects cesses and surcharges, right? So what happens is that the state government say that, boss, you are giving concessions, like for instance, there were deep cuts that were done in corporate income tax, right? So that is going to eventually hurt the states, because states ka jo shareable pie hai, that comes down to that extent, right? And you compensate all of this with your cesses and surcharges, which you don't need to share with us. So that is a problem over here, right? So there are a lot of different suggestions which can be incorporated for improving state finances, right? So the first is that we need to maintain some kind of a balance between tax and non-tax revenue, right? So the own tax and non-tax revenue of gross state domestic product, so it should increase in a sustained manner, right? But we should not increase undue burden upon the people, right? So that is one thing. Apart from that, we have to prioritize inflow of private investments to less developed states. Now this is easier said than done. Like for instance, what is happening over here, or what is explained over here is, right, that more developed states, like let's say a Karnataka or a Maharashtra or a Tamil Nadu or a Gujarat, right? These are your typical states where a lot of private investments flow because of already developed infrastructure, already developed ecosystem, already developed facilities, and so on and so forth. So they keep getting more and more investments, they keep getting more and more official aid via bilateral, multilateral agency, and other states keep lagging behind, right? Now, for example, Chhattisgarh has great rich resources, has great potential, but it doesn't have adequate resources to achieve this high growth. So a high time that we start prioritizing flow of resources towards these less developed states. Baki, there are recommendations of the 12th Finance Commission, right? So they made a multidimensional restructuring of government finances related recommendation, right? So they spoke about taxation reforms, right? So that a non-distortionary and a revenue elastic system of taxation is available, right? They spoke about non-tax revenues, right? About user charges, right? Collect appropriate user charges for services rendered. They spoke about expenditure restructuring, right? In the sense that, implement schemes properly, do some kind of direct benefit transfer if that needs to be done, rationalize your subsidies, fiscal transfer system, right? Equalizing transfers, right? And ensure that local bodies get appropriate transfers, strengthening of local bodies, and suggesting institutional framework including ceiling on debt and deficit. So these were relevant recommendations. They have been reiterated by a number of bodies. And similarly, 15th Finance Commission has also made certain recommendations, right? And I'll be sharing this document with you. So the conclusion is that ultimately the state government's finances need to be improved. And for that, we need to work upon multiple prongs, right? Whether it is revenue mobilization or fiscal management or utilization of resources, there is room for improvement on all of these fronts. And if these areas do actually get improved, then as we just saw that state governments, they spend a huge chunk of money. So when it comes to boosting economic growth, or when it comes to, creating infrastructure or creating the necessary ecosystem at the ground level, state governments are the most important stakeholders in that. So in that sense, we need to work in the right earnest. So this is my submission to you today, my friends. We have spoken about two very important, very bulky topics. One was related to our trade and another was related to our state finances. I hope that this made sense to you. If there is any observations, questions, comments that you have, please feel free to share with us. In the meanwhile, we will definitely find mechanisms of sharing our content with you. Already we are having a fantastic app which you should download, from where you will be able to get a lot of weekly and monthly current affairs compilations free, good compilations, excellent compilations. So keep that in mind, and you can always get in touch with us for any kind of professional guidance, career guidance, any kind of exam related query that you have, and anything related to economics at all. Ecoholics is the name to remember. Thank you so much, guys. We'll meet you again on Monday. Until then, thank you so much. All the very best. Take care, and Jai Hind to all of you guys. Thank you.